Amelia stood at the edge of the cliff, her shoes barely touching the cracked and weathered stones beneath her. The wind whipped through her hair, and she could hear the distant crash of waves far below, where the ocean's raw power met the jagged rocks. It was the kind of place where one could easily lose themselves, and yet she felt more grounded here than anywhere else in her life. She stared at the horizon, the distant city lights flickering like tiny stars far below the curve of the earth. The weight in her chest was heavy, suffocating. The months leading up to this moment had been filled with defeat, each one compounding the last. She had been trying to build a career as a sculptor, a dream she had nurtured since childhood, but it felt as though she had spent more time battling the walls of the art world than creating anything that mattered. Her studio had been empty for weeks now. The few pieces of work she had made had been rejected by galleries, criticized by mentors, and ignored by potential buyers. Her savings were dwindling, and her confidence was all but gone. The spark of hope she had once held on to had been smothered by relentless disappointment. A sharp breath escaped her as she squeezed her eyes shut, trying to push away the tears threatening to fall. "Why am I still here?" she thought, her mind clouded with doubt. It would be so easy to just give up, to leave behind the dream that had consumed her life, to stop fighting against the tide of rejection and failure. Her hands trembled as she reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out the crumpled letter from her latest rejection. "Amelia, your work does not fit our current direction." Each word felt like a reminder of how far she had fallen. "Maybe it's time to quit," she whispered to herself. Her voice was barely audible above the wind. "Maybe I'm just not good enough." For a long moment, she stood there, as if the very earth might open up and swallow her. Yet, something deep inside her stirred a flicker of defiance, a whisper from the small voice she had tried to suppress for months. She wasn't ready to give up, not yet. Amelia's life before the rejections had been full of promise. She grew up in a small town, where her father worked as a mechanic and her mother ran a local bookstore. Art had always been her refuge. She spent hours sketching in her room, her imagination flowing onto the paper as easily as breathing. Her parents were supportive, never questioning her passion, even though they didn't fully understand it. When she was accepted into the prestigious New York Academy of Fine Arts, she had felt like she was on the cusp of something extraordinary. Her professors praised her work. Her fellow students admired her, and for the first time, she thought maybe, just maybe, she could make a name for herself in the world of art. But New York was nothing like the dream she had imagined. The city, with its dizzying pace and cutthroat competitiveness, quickly crushed her naive optimism. There were hundreds of artists, all desperate to stand out, all convinced they had something to offer that no one else could. The pressure to be different was stifling. Still, Amelia held on. She worked tirelessly in her small studio apartment, trying to perfect her craft, trying to make something new, something bold. Yet, each attempt felt like an echo of someone else's work. The more she tried to stand out, the more she felt like she was sinking into obscurity. It wasn't until the day she received her first rejection letter that the cracks began to form. She had submitted a series of sculpture pieces she had poured her heart and soul into, convinced that they were her best work yet. She had waited weeks, pacing her apartment, watching the mailbox like it was her lifeline. When the letter finally came, it was thin to thin. She opened it with trembling hands, only to find the brief, disheartening words. "We regret to inform you that your work does not align with our current collection." The rejection shattered something inside her. At first, she tried to brush it off. But then came the second rejection, and the third. Each one left a deeper mark. Soon, the walls of her apartment felt like a prison, and the hope she had carried with her from her small town seemed like a distant memory. The months passed, and Amelia's optimism continued to erode. She stopped sculpting for days at a time, her studio untouched. She had been in the city for 3 years now, and with each passing month, the weight of failure seemed to grow heavier. She couldn't avoid the questions that lingered at the back of her mind. Why do I keep trying? What am I doing here? It wasn't until she received a message from her mother that the question broke through the fog of her self-doubt. Amelia, sweetheart, we're coming to visit next weekend. It's been too long. We miss you. At first, Amelia felt a pang of guilt. She hadn't seen her parents in over a year. Not since she had buried herself in the grind of the city. She had thought about going back home, but each time she did, the shame of failure seemed to grow larger. How could she go back when she hadn't made anything of herself? But there was something in her mother's words, a quiet plea that tugged at her heart. Amelia hadn't realized how much she missed them until she saw the message. The visit was a quiet one. They spent most of their time sitting in the small apartment she had rented, sipping tea and talking. Her father, ever the optimist, didn't say much about her art, knowing how deeply the rejections had affected her. But her mother had always been the one to see beyond the surface. You know, darling, her mother said one afternoon as they sat on the couch, when I look at you, I see someone who's never been afraid of trying. You've always thrown yourself into your art, always put your whole heart into it. Amelia felt a lump in her throat. She hadn't expected to hear that. She had felt so far removed from the person her mother described. Someone full of courage and hope. Her mother continued. But even the best artists face rejection. Even the most talented face failure. The trick is not to let it define you. You've been through so much already, Amelia. You've proven that you can keep going, no matter what happens. Amelia's mother's words stayed with her long after the visit ended. Back in New York, she spent days reflecting on her journey. She realized that, in a way, she had been waiting for the art world to recognize her, to validate her. But she had forgotten one crucial thing. She had to believe in herself first. She returned to her studio, not with the intent to impress or to prove anything to anyone, but with the simple goal of creating for herself. She found herself reaching for the clay again, feeling its cool, smooth texture beneath her fingers. And for the first time in months, the weight of expectation lifted. The sculptures that emerged from those quiet days in the studio were different. They weren't perfect. They weren't glamorous. But they were hers. And for the first time in ages, Amelia could feel the spark of passion in every piece she created. A month later, Amelia received another email. A gallery in Brooklyn had seen her recent work and wanted to showcase it in an upcoming exhibit. She couldn't believe it. After months of silence, of questioning her worth, this opportunity felt like a dream. The opening night was everything she had hoped for and more. People walked around the gallery, nodding in appreciation as they examined her sculptures. Her heart swelled as she overheard their conversations, their admiration for her work. That night, as she stood by one of her pieces, a man approached her. He was tall, dressed in a crisp suit, and his eyes held a gleam of genuine interest. I've seen a lot of art, but this speaks to me, he said, his voice filled with awe. There's something raw and real about it. I'd love to represent you, help get your work into more galleries. Amelia could hardly contain her excitement. It wasn't just the recognition that mattered, it was the understanding that she had not given up on herself, even when it had seemed like the world had. Years later, Amelia stood in front of a packed room at her own solo exhibition. Her sculptures displayed elegantly on white pedestals. The city was buzzing with excitement about her work, and she had finally built a name for herself in the art world. The road had been long and filled with obstacles, but she had never given up. Through the rejections, the self-doubt, and the quiet moments of defeat, Amelia had learned the most important lesson of all. Sometimes, the greatest victory is not in the achievement itself, but in the persistence to keep moving forward, no matter how hard it gets.